Section 100. Brundon Hall. Mr. Barham, in his Life of his father, the author of the world-famed Ingoldsby Legends, cites the following curious circumstances from the Reverend author's diary. Barham states that the story is current in the Carter family, of which his first wife was a member, and that it was told to him by Dr. Roberts. One day, proceeds his narrative, about the year 1785, two lads, one of whom was the uncle of the lady in question, were playing in the large hall of Brundon Hall, a mansion situated on the borders of Suffolk. Footnote: it is actually in Essex, and now forms part of Sudbury. End of footnote. And at that time the property of the Carters, but which afterwards passed into the possession of the Hurrells. The attention of the boys was suddenly caught by the opening of a door, usually kept locked, which led to the more ancient part of the landing, and they were more astonished still by the appearance of a strange lady dressed in blue satin, who slowly walked towards the great staircase, stamped 3 times on a large slab of blue stone which lay at the foot, and then, continuing her walk across the hall, disappeared through the door opposite the one by which she had entered. The boys, more puzzled than frightened, left off playing, and ran and told Mrs. Carter, the mistress of the house, and the mother of the narrator's, Mr. Roberts' uncle. She immediately fainted. Subsequently she told her son that the apparition had been frequently seen by other members of the family, and that there was a very dreadful story connected with it, which, however, she declined to communicate. Some years afterwards, the house having, I believe, changed hands in the interval, certain repairs were undertaken, in the course of which the entrance to a large vault was discovered, concealed by the stone upon which the lady in blue satin had stamped. On examination 2 skeletons were found below. A gold bracelet was on the arm of one, and gold spurs were lying near the feet of the other. In addition, a goblet having some dark-colored sediment at the bottom, supposed to be blood, was found in a recess in the wall, and a considerable quantity of infants' skulls and bones were heaped up in one corner. Lastly, a considerable sum in gold coin was brought to light. The present representative of the Hurrells informs me that he is ignorant of the tradition attaching to Brundon Hall, but he adds that a pair of antique spurs and a sword were directed by his great-grandfather in his will to be preserved as heirlooms in the family. How far this coincidence may be thought to corroborate the story of the well-known Sudbury apparition, afterwards to be referred to, must be left to the reader to decide.
Section 101. Burton Agnes Hall. Amongst the haunted houses of Great Britain, those which are the permanent residence of certain skulls are the most curious. Various grand old halls, quaint farmhouses, and ancient dwellings scattered about the kingdom are troubled at times by all kinds of supernatural disturbances, in consequence of some long and carefully preserved skull being removed from its resting place, or otherwise interfered with. These pages furnish several singular instances of such legends connected with old ancestral dwellings, but none more curious or devoutly believed in than that connected with Burton Agnes Hall, the family seat of Sir Henry Somerville Boynton. Burton Agnes is a picturesque village between Bridlington and Driffield, in the East Riding of Yorkshire. It has some pretty cottages, a handsome church, containing several splendid tombs of the Boynton, Griffiths, and Somerville families, one of the last dating back to 1336, and the grand old hall, the residence of the Boyntons. The village, which is chiefly, if not entirely, owned by the Boyntons, lies on the slope of the Wolds. A long chain of hills sweep round it from Flamborough Head on the north, whence extensive views over the lowlands of Holderness are obtainable. The Hall, says Mr. F. Ross, from whose interesting article in the Leeds Mercury much of the following information is derived, is a large and picturesque building of red brick with stone coins, a mixture of the Tudor, Elizabethan, and Jacobean styles, with a long broken façade, ornamented with octagonal bays in the wings and mullioned windows. In the interior are a grand hall, with a fine carved screen, behind which is the magnificent staircase, a noble gallery, containing a choice collection of paintings, an apartment which has not its equal for many miles. All the chief apartments are profusely ornamented with carved woodwork, over the fireplace of the hall being a curious specimen representing the Empire of Death. Inigo Jones is said to have designed the hall, and Rubens to have decorated some portions of the interior. Inwardly and outwardly, this English home is as magnificent as it is curious yet comfortable. From the grand entrance gateway, an avenue of yew trees stretches away to the porch of the hall, producing a picturesque effect. Standing, as the edifice does, on an elevation, the panorama seen over the surrounding neighborhood from its windows is both grand and impressive. Altogether, Burton Agnes Hall might be deemed in every respect a desirable dwelling. But there is a skeleton, or rather a portion of one, in this splendid mansion. In the course of centuries the estates had passed, by descent, into possession of the De Somervilles, Griffiths, and Boynton families, until they became vested in the persons of three sisters, co-heiresses. A painting at the Hall represents these three ladies in costumes of the Elizabethan period, and in one of the upper rooms is the portrait of a lady, apparently one of these three, the bodily representative of the spirit which haunts the ancient mansion, and who is familiarly and irreverently called Auld Nance by the domestics. The skull of this lady is preserved at the Hall, much against the will, it is averred, of the inhabitants thereof, but it is more than mortal dare do to remove it. When this relic of mortality is left quietly upon its resting place, all goes well. But whenever any attempt is made to remove it, most diabolical disturbances and unearthly noises are raised in the house, and last until it is restored. The story to account for these phenomena, as told by Mr. Ross, is as follows. The three ladies, co-heiresses of the estate of Burton Agnes, were in possession of considerable wealth, and had very exalted ideas of the dignity of the family. For a while they resided in the ancient mansion, which had been the home of several generations of Griffiths and Somervilles, but it had become dilapidated, and was altogether out of fashion with the existing Elizabethan style of architecture, now emerging into the Jacobean, and the three ladies began to think it altogether too mean for the residence of so important a family as theirs. They had many consultations on the subject, and, at length, determined to erect a hall in such a style as should eclipse the splendour all the mansions in the neighbourhood, even that of the mighty Earls of Northumberland at Leconfield, a few miles distant. The most active promoter of the scheme was Anne, the younger sister, who could talk, think, and dream of nothing but the magnificent home to be erected for themselves and their descendants. Money they had in abundance. They called in the best architects of the day to furnish designs. Bricklayers, masons, and carpenters were seen at work building up the mansion. And then, for the decorative portions, the genius of Inigo Jones and the talents of Rubens were employed on whatever portion of the interior that was susceptible of artistic treatment. In process of time it emerged from the hands of artists and workmen like a palace erected by the genii of the Arabian Nights, a palace encrusted throughout on walls, roof, and furniture with the most exquisite carvings and sculptures of the most skilled masters of the age, and radiant with the most glowing tints of the pencil of Peter Paul. Of the three sisters, Anne took the most lively interest in the new house. She witnessed the uprising walls, the development of the architectural features of the grand façade, and the outgrowth of the chiselled design of the interior under the cunning handicraft of the carvers and sculptors. with the most rapturous delight, and, when it was completed, could never sufficiently admire its symmetrical proportions, noble hall, stately gallery, and manifold artistic enrichments. Some little time after its completion and occupation by its lady owners, Anne, the enthusiast, paid an afternoon visit to the St. Quintins at Harpham, about nightfall proposing to return home. She was wholly unattended, excepting by a dog, as the houses were only about a mile apart, singing merrily as she went along. As she approached St. John's Well, she perceived two ruffianly-looking mendicants stretched on the grass by its side. This was a very numerous and dangerous class, since the dissolution of the monasteries, at whose gates they had been supplied with food, and lived by traversing the country, and going from abbey to priory and priory to abbey, being generally too lazy to apply themselves to work. And although parochial poor laws had been passed in the 2 or 3 preceding reigns, it had been left in a great measure to the people to contribute to the poor funds, more by way of a benevolence than as a compulsory rate, so that many parishes shirked the collection altogether, and thus the roads of the country and the streets of the towns swarmed with sturdy beggars, who would take no denial when they were able to demand alms by threats and violence. The lady approached them with some tremor, but did not feel much fear, as she was still within the precincts of Harpham, and not far from those who would afford her protection. The men rose as she came up to them, and asked alms, and she drew out her purse and gave them a few coins, but in doing so the glitter of her finger ring attracted their notice, and, in a threatening tone, they demanded that it should be given up to them. As it was an heirloom that she inherited from her mother, she valued it above all price, and declared she could not, on any account, give up her mother's ring. "Mother or no mother," replied one of the men in a gruff tone, "we mean to have it, and if you do not bestow it freely, we must take it." So saying, he seized her hand, and attempted to draw off the ring. At this manifestation of violence she screamed aloud for help, when the other ruffian, exclaiming, "Stop that noise!" struck her a blow on the head with his stick, and she fell senseless to the earth. Her screams had reached the village, and some rustics came hurrying up, upon which the villains made a hasty retreat, without being able to get the ring from her finger. She was found, as it was supposed, dead or dying, and was carried carefully to Harpham Hall, where, under the care of Lady St. Quintin and the application of restoratives, she recovered sufficiently to be removed the following day to her home. Although she was restored to sensibility, she was suffering acutely from the blow, and was placed in bed in a state of utter prostration. She remained so for a few days, becoming weaker gradually, until, despite the tender nursing of her sisters and the best medical advice that York could afford, she fell a victim to the brutal attack of the robbers, and was buried in the church of Britian Agnes. During these few intervening days she was alternately sensible and delirious, but in whichever state she was, her thoughts seemed to turn on what had latterly been the passion of her life, her affection for her fondly loved home. "Sisters," said she, "never shall I sleep peacefully in my grave in the churchyard, unless I, or a part of me at least, remain here in our beautiful home as long as it lasts. Promise me this, dear sisters, that when I am dead, my head shall be taken from my body and preserved within these walls. Here let it for ever remain, and on no account be removed. And understand and make it known to those who in future shall become possessors of the house, that if they disobey this my last injunction, my spirit shall, if so able and so permitted, make such disturbance within its walls as to render it uninhabitable for others so long as my head is divorced from its home." Her sisters, to pacify her, promised to obey her instructions, but without any intention of keeping the promise, and the body was laid entire and unmutilated under the pavement of the church. About a week after the interment, as the inhabitants of the Hall were preparing one evening to retire to rest, they were alarmed by a sudden and loud crash in one of the upstairs rooms. The two sisters and the domestics rushed up together in great consternation, but after much trembling came to the conclusion that some heavy piece of furniture had fallen, and the manservants, of whom there were two in the house, went upstairs to ascertain the cause of the noise, but were not able to find anything to account for it. The household became still more alarmed at this report, and for a long time were afraid to go to bed, but hearing nothing further, at length retired, and the night passed away without further disturbance. Nothing more occurred until the same night in the following week, when the inmates were aroused from sleep in the dead of the night by a loud clapping to, seemingly, of half a dozen of the doors. With fear-stricken countenances and hair standing on end, they struck lights and mustered up sufficient courage to go over the house. They found all the doors closed, but for a while the clapping continued, but always in a different part of the house, remote from where they were. At length the disturbance ceased, and as nothing untoward followed the noise of the preceding week, they again ventured to return to their beds, where they lay sleepless and quaking with fear until daylight. Another week of quietness passed away, but on the corresponding night they were again disturbed by what appeared to be a crowd of persons hurrying along the galleries and up and down the stairs, which was followed by a sound of groaning as from a dying person. On this occasion they were all too terrified to leave their beds, but lay crouching under the bedclothes, perspiring with fear. The following day the female servants fled from the house, refusing to remain any longer in companionship with the ghost, which, they all concluded, was the author of the unearthly noises. The two ladies took counsel with their neighbor, Mr. (afterwards Sir) William St. Quentin, and the vicar of the parish. In the course of conversation it occurred to them that the noises took place on the same night of the week that Anne had died, and the sisters remembered her dying words, and their promise that some part of her body should be preserved in the house. Also her threat that if her wish were not complied with, she would, if she were so permitted, render the house uninhabitable for others, and it appeared evident that she was carrying out her threat. The question then was, what was to be done in order to carry out her wish, and the clergyman suggested that the coffin should be opened to see if that could throw any light on the matter. This was done the following day, when a ghastly spectacle presented itself. The body lay without any marks of corruption or decay, but the head was disengaged from the trunk, and appeared to be rapidly assuming the semblance of a fleshless skull. This was reported to the ladies, who, although terrified at the idea, agreed to the suggestion of the vicar that the skull should be brought to the house, which was done, and so long as it was allowed to remain undisturbed on the table where it was placed, the house was not troubled with visitations of a ghostly nature. Many attempts have since been made to rid the Hall of the skull, but without success, as whenever it has been removed, the ghostly knockings have been resumed, and no rest or peace enjoyed until it has been restored. On one occasion a maidservant threw it from the window upon a passing load of manure, but from that moment the horses were not able to move the wagon an inch, and despite the vigorous whipping of the wagoner, all their efforts were in vain, until the servant confessed what she had done, when the skull was brought back into the house, and the horses drew the wagon along without the least difficulty. On another, one of the Boyntons caused it to be buried in the garden, when the most dismal wailings and cries kept the house in a state of disquietude and alarm until it was dug up and restored to its place in the hall, when they ceased. A correspondent of Mr. Ross, to whom, indeed, that gentleman was indebted for some of the particulars already given, furnished him with the following account of his own personal experience of the Burton Agnes hauntings, gained during a night spent at the Hall. He writes: "Some 40 years ago, John Bilton, a cousin of mine, came from London on a visit to the neighbourhood, and having a relative, Matthew Potter, who was a gamekeeper on the estate and resided in the Hall, he paid him a visit, and was invited to pass the night there. Potter, however, told him that according to popular report the house was haunted, and that if he were afraid of ghosts he had better sleep elsewhere. But John, who was a daredevil sort of a fellow, altogether untinctured by superstitious fancies, replied, 'Afraid? Not I, indeed. I care not how many ghosts there may be in the house, so long as they do not molest me.' Potter then told him of the skull and the portrait of Odd Nance, and asked him if he would like to see the latter. The skull, it would appear, from what followed, was not then in the house. He replied that he should like to see the picture, and they passed into the room where it was hanging, and Potter held up the candle before the portrait, when, in a moment, and without any apparent cause, the candle became extinguished, and defied all attempts at blowing in again, and they were obliged to grope their way to the bedroom in the dark. They occupied the same bed, and Potter was soon asleep and snoring, but Bilton, ruminating over the tale of the skull, and the curious circumstance of the sudden extinguishment of the light in front of the portrait of the ghost, lay awake. When he had lain musing for half an hour, he heard a shuffling of feet outside the chamber door, which at first he ascribed to the servants going to bed. But as the sounds did not cease, but kept increasing, he nudged his bedfellow and said, "Matty, what the deuce is all that row about?" "Ginny Hewlett's owls," replied his companion in a half-waking tone, and turning over again began to snore. The noises became more uproarious, and it seemed as if 10 or a dozen persons were scuffling about in the passage just outside, and rushing in and out of the rooms, slamming the doors with great violence, upon which he gave his friend another vigorous nudge in the ribs, exclaiming, "Wake up, Matty! Don't you hear that confounded row? What does it all mean?" "Ginny Hewlett's," again muttered his bedfellow. "Ginny Hewlett's," replied Bilton. "Ginny Hewlett's can't make such an infernal uproar as that." Matty, who was now more awakened, listened a moment, and then said, "It's Odd Nance, but I niver took any notice of her," and he rolled over and again began to snore. After this, the fun grew fast and furious. A struggling fight seemed to be going on outside, and the clapping of the doors reverberated in the passage like thunderclaps. He expected every moment to see the chamber door fly open, and Odd Nance with a troop of ghosts come rushing in. But no such catastrophe occurred, and after a while the noises ceased, and about daylight he fell asleep. The writer adds that his cousin, though a fear-naught and a thorough disbeliever in the supernatural, told him that he never passed so fearful a night before in his life. It would not sleep another night in the place if he were offered the hall itself for doing so. He further adds that his cousin was a thoroughly truthful man, who might be implicitly believed, and that he had the narrative from his own lips on the following day. End of Section 101.
Section 103, Calverley Hall. Calverley is an old-fashioned village in Yorkshire, chiefly known to historians and strangers as the scene of a terrible tragedy which took place early in the 17th century. The hall, although now modernized and otherwise mutilated, and subdivided into 7 dwellings, still retains many remains of its ancient picturesqueness. Once the residence of the ancient Calverley family, whose pedigree is traced back to the time of the Empress Maud, and of whom Mr. John Batty has preserved records in his History of Rothwell, as far back as 1457, and amongst whose most distinguished scions may be mentioned the late C.S. Calverley, the poet, Old Calverley Hall was formerly a place of great importance as well as medieval comfort. Mr. William Scruton, in the Yorkshireman of January 5th, 1884, describes fully the present condition of the fine old place, telling of traces of ancient carving, of oak ceilings and battlemented corbels, of decorated Gothic windows, and of many vestiges of the former grandeur of the place. One chamber in particular is not only noteworthy on account of its fine oaken paneling and archaic specimens of fresco work, but because it was therein that the bloody deed which has rendered the place forever dreadful and dreaded was committed. The doorway, says Mr. Scruton, which led to the flight of steps down which Walter Calverley threw the servant, is now blocked up. The story of the tragedy connected with Calverley Hall has been a favorite theme for authors and antiquarians from the days of John Whitaker to those of John Timms, but all that is necessary to repeat of it here may be given from a very condensed account by Mr. Samuel Margerson of Calverley, cited in the above number of the Yorkshireman. He says, Walter Calverley, whose father was a rich Roman Catholic, was a wild, reckless man, though his wife was a most estimable and virtuous lady. It is said that he inherited insanity from his mother's family. Be that as it may, on the 23rd of April, 1604, he went into a fit of insane frenzy of jealousy, or pretended to do so. The fact was, he had completely beggared himself, and got over head and ears into debt. Moneylenders were pressing him hard, and he had become desperate. Rushing madly into the house, he snatched up one and then another of his children, plunged his dagger into them, threw them down, and then attempted to take the life of their mother. A steel corset which she wore was luckily in the way and saved her life. The assassin, however, thought he had killed her and left hurriedly. He then mounted his horse, intending to kill the only other child he had, Henry, a brat at nurse, who was then at Norton. He was pursued by some villagers. His horse fell and threw him off, and so he was caught. When brought to trial at York, he refused to plead, knowing that thereby his estates would not be forfeited to the crown, but would descend to his surviving son, and this according to the well-known law of peine forte et dure. Walter Calverley was punished for his crime by being pressed to death at York Castle. Tradition saith that an old servant was with him when they were putting the stones on his chest that were to crush out his life, and that the wretched criminal begged him to put him out of his misery by sitting on the stones, saying, "A pund more weight, lig on, lig on." The old servant complied with his request, but was straightway hanged for his pains. Walter was buried at St. Mary's, Castlegate, York, but there is a tradition that, after several pretended interments, his body was secretly buried at Calverley, among the remains of the 16 previous generations of the Calverleys. Little wonder that after so dire a tragedy, Calverley and its precincts were regarded as haunted ground. Walter's spirit, says Mr. Scruton, could not rest. He was often seen galloping about the district at night on a headless horse, and was generally accompanied by a number of followers similarly mounted, who delighted to run down any poor benighted folks who happened to be thereabouts. These spectral horsemen generally disappeared into a cave in the wood, but this cave has now been quarried away. At last the ghostly horsemen became so troublesome that the vicar of Calverley Church undertook the task of laying it, and, for a time at least, succeeded in getting rid of the bogey. Walter was not to appear again as long as hollies grew green in Calverley Wood. The hollies still grow green in that wood, but apparently something has occurred to prevent the spell from being quite successful, as the following incidents would seem to show. The Reverend Richard Birdsall, a devoted Wesleyan preacher, having to preach at Calverley about a century ago, was entertained as a guest at the hall on a certain Saturday evening in the month of January. About 12 o'clock, records the reverend gentleman, I was conducted up one pair of stairs into a large room which was surrounded by an oaken wainscot after the ancient plan. After my usual devotions, I laid down to rest. I had not been asleep long before I thought something crept up to my breast, pressing me much. I was greatly agitated and struggled hard to wake. In this situation, according to the best judgment I could form, the bed seemed to swing as if it had been slung in slings, and I was thrown out onto the floor. When I came to myself, I soon got on my knees and returned thanks to God that I was not hurt. Committing myself to his care, I got into bed the second time. After lying for about 15 minutes, reasoning with myself whether I had been thrown out of bed or whether I had got out in my sleep, to satisfy me fully on this point, I was clearly thrown out a second time from between the bedclothes to the floor by just such a motion as before described. I quickly got on my knees to pray to the Almighty for my safety and to thank him that I was not hurt. After this, I crept under the bed to feel if there was anything there, but I found nothing. I got into bed for the third time. Just as I laid myself down, I was led to ask, "Am I in my right senses?" I answered, "Yes, Lord, if ever I had any." I had not lain a minute before I was thrown out of bed a third time. After this, I once more crept under the bed to ascertain whether all the cords were fast, and examined until I touched all the bedposts, but I found all right. This was about 1 o'clock. I now put on my clothes, not attempting to lie down any more. I was afterwards told that this very house had formerly been the residence of Calverley, who, in the reign of King James, was tried at York for the murder of his wife and 2 children, and standing neuter, was pressed to death in the castle. Such is the worthy preacher's record of the way in which he was tormented in the haunted hall, but other and more recent manifestations of spectral agency are believed to have taken place. The last mad freak of the ghost of poor Walter Calverley, according to Mr. Scruton, took place about 12 years ago, when, toward the close of the year, the bell in the church tower began to toll at 1 o'clock in the morning, and went on tolling for a long, long time. Men came rushing to the scene, some of whom had come out of warm, comfortable beds, and some who had not been in bed at all. All were struck dumb with terror and cold. The keys could not be found. Toll, 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 still went out the mysterious sounds in the night winds. At last came the keys, but just as they rattled at the keyhole, the noise stopped, and all was silent as death. Although such supposed direct manifestations of Walter Calverley's ghostly powers have not been repeated of late, certain weird signs of the tragedy are, it is said, still visible. Stains of blood, irremovable stains, are yet to be seen on the floor, and there is a flag, one particular flag, in the cellar, which always has a mysterious damp place on it. All the other flags are dry, save this. Wise men have tried, says Mr. Scruton, to account for this, but as yet have signally failed. Here it is, plain to be seen, and what one sees, one can believe. A correspondent writes that a Bradford paper, published in March 1874, in an article entitled "Calverley 40 Years Ago," gives the following anecdote as proof of how strong an impression had been made upon the public mind by the old legend connected with this place. The writer of the article describes how, in his youthful days, he assisted at an attempt to raise the ghost of the old murderous squire. The modus operandi, he says, was as follows. About a dozen of the scholars, having leisure and fired with the imaginative spirit, used to assemble after school hours close to the venerable church of Calverley, and then put their hats and caps down on the ground in a pyramidal form. Then, taking hold of each other's hands, they formed a magic circle, holding firmly together and making use of an old refrain. Old Calverley, I have thee by the ears, I'll cut thee into collops unless thee appears. Whilst this incantation was going on, crumbs of bread, saved from their dinner, and mixed with pins, were strewn on the ground. The meanwhile the lads tramped round in the circle with a heavy tread. Some of the more venturesome boys had to go round to each of the church doors, and whistle aloud through the keyholes, repeating the magical couplet which their comrades in the circle were chanting. At this culminating point, a pale and ghostly figure was expected to appear, and, on one occasion, some such apparition does seem to have issued forth, apparently from the church. The lads, in their terrified haste to avoid the ghost's fearful grasp, scampered off as fast as their legs would carry them, leaving their hats and caps scattered about the ground as legitimate spoil for old Calverley. End of section 103.
Section 110, Dobb Park Lodge. On the southern slope of a picturesque valley through which the Washburn pours its waters stands the ruins of Dobb Park Lodge, a lofty, four-storied mansion of the Tudor period. About half of the original building is supposed to have been pulled down, not to have been destroyed by the slow processes of time, and the remainder to have been left standing, though uninhabitable. In its pristine state, the lodge must have been an elegant and spacious pile, and even now, ruined and deserted as it is a picturesque feature in the romantic scenery around. There are some singular traits in the building, as, for instance, the fact that, apparently, the only means of access to its interior was by a winding stair in a projecting turret in the rear. Of the southern front of the residence, one half remains, and contains square windows of 2 lights each, divided by a transom. Over the lower, relates a correspondent, is a cornice embracing both, supported by brackets, ornamented with armorial shields, charged with quoits or circular discs. In the center are the remains of a projecting semicircle window. Who lived in this strange and romantically situated abode, history tells not. Shaw, the historian of Wharfdale, says, "There was a court held in it long after it was dilapidated, called Dog Court, belonging to the Duchy of Lancaster, and that appears to be all that is known of it, although this same authority supposes, omitting all account of its Tudor architecture, that it was erected about the same time as Barton Lodge, a building in existence in 1311. But if history has neglected Dobb Park Lodge, tradition has not overlooked it, and, amongst other remarkable stories of it, records that the place is haunted by a strange being known as the Talking Dog. The tale of this marvelous spectre bears a likeness to a well-known Manx and some other equally famous legends. It has been related to us by Mr. William Grange of Harrogate, who obtained it from a lover of forest lore, a collector and preserver of all that belongs thereto. But it was taken down in the dialect of the neighborhood, and to render it comprehensible to the general reader, it will be necessary to translate it into the ordinary vernacular. The legend is as follows. At the foot of the winding stair already alluded to is a doorway, now choked with rubbish, leading into a dungeon. The country folks thereabouts believe this doorway to be the entrance to one of those mysterious passages, so generally ascribed to old ruins, which lead to some strangely terrible cavern or other abode of horror. Such unearthly noises were heard to issue from this subterranean place that no one ventured to explore its mysteries, until at length a countryman, one of those ne'er-do-wells who are ever ready to risk what respectable people prudently shrink from, determined to examine it thoroughly, and, in order to fortify himself for the arduous task, he imbibed a no small quantum of potent stimulant. Thus invigorated, the local Columbus seized his lanthorn, bravely entered the passage, and instantly disappeared in its gloomy recesses. His neighbors and admirers lingered about the place in expectation of his speedy return, but his absence was so prolonged that they became seriously alarmed. At length, when they had all given him up for lost, he reappeared, but in a most wretched, abject, and terrified condition. Some long time afterwards, when he had recovered from his fright, he was induced to give a recital of his adventures, and his account was this. After leaving the doorway, I went for a long distance, rambling and scrambling, turning and twisting about the crooked passages, until I thought I should get to no place at all. So I began to feel rather dazed and tired-like, and had some thoughts of turning back again, when suddenly the sweetest music that ever I had heard in all my born days struck up right before me. I couldn't have turned back then if I had wanted to ever so much, for the sound charmed me completely. I had never felt so lightsome before, and feared nothing, and could have gone anywhere. I followed up where the music seemed to come from, thinking I should come to it at last, but I was wrong. I have never seen the players to this very day. I kept following the sound until at last I came to what seemed to be a great, long, high, wide room, as big as any church, and bigger than some. At one side of it was a great fire blazing away as bright as the sunshine, and either it or something else made everything glitter like gold. Thinks I to myself, this is a grand place and no mistake. But what struck me more than all was a great, black, rough dog, as big as any 2 or 3 mastiffs, which stood before the fire, and appeared to be the master of the place, for not another living creature beside it could I see. I was troubled to make him out. I had heard tell of bar-guests, footnote, a provincial name for spectres, end of footnote, but had never seen one, and thought this might be one of them. At last, by all that is true, if the thing did not open its mouth and speak, not bark like a dog, as it ought to have done, but talked just like one of ourselves. Didn't I feel queer now? I think I just did. That did for me more than all the rest. I wished myself safe out again and over the mile bridge. It said, "Now, my man, as you've come here, you must do one of 3 things, or you'll never see daylight again. You must either drink all the liquor there is in that glass, open that chest, or draw that sword." I looked, and there I saw a strange, great chest, seemingly bound with iron bands, and with 2 or 3 great iron locks on it. At the top of that chest was placed a fine great glass, with a long stem, full of the nicest-looking drinking stuff that I ever saw. Above that, on a peg or something of the sort, against the wall was hung what he called the sword, a great, long, broad, heavy, ugly thing, nearly as long as myself. I looked them all over and over again, considering which job to do, for I durstn't, for the life of me, think of not doing what the dog bade me. The chest looked much too strong for me to open. Besides, I had no tools with me that would be likely to open it with, and, as for the sword, I knew naught about sword work. I had never held one in my life, and should be quite as likely to cut myself as anyone else with it, so I thought I would let it alone. Then there was naught but the drink left for me, and I began to feel rather dryish, what with rambling about the place so long, and what with the drop of drink I had before I started. So says I to myself, here goes at the drink. I took hold of the glass with my hand, the dog all the time glowering at me with all the eyes he had, and, I assure you, he had 2 whoppers. Saucers are not so big. They were more like pewter plates, and gleamed and glittered like fire. I lifted the glass up to my mouth and just touched my lips with the stuff, to taste before I gave a big swig, when, wouldn't you believe it, it scalded, just like boiling water, or burnt like fire itself. All the skin's off my lips and tongue end with it yet. If I'd swallowed all the lot, it would have burned my inside clean out, and I should have been as hollow as a drum. But I stopped short of that, or else I should have made a bonny mess of it. I just tasted the stuff, but what it is I cannot tell. It was not the color of aquafortis, but it was quite as hot. As soon as ever I tasted it, up flew the lid of the chest with a bonny bang, and I do declare it didn't seem to be as full of gold as ever it could cram. I'd be bound to say there were thousands upon thousands of pounds in that very chest. But I'm no better for that, nor ever shall be, for I'll never go there any more. The sword, at the same time, was drawn by somebody's hand that I didn't see, and it glittered and flashed like lightning. I banged the glass down, and don't know whether it broke or not, but all the stuff was spilt. In a minute after, all was dark as pitch. The fire went out, my lantern had gone out before, the music gave over playing, and, instead of it, such a howling and yelling struck up and filled the place as I'd never heard in my time. It seemed as if hundreds of dogs were all getting walloped at once, and something besides screamed and yelled as if it were frightened out of its wits. Oh, it was awful. I fell down flat on the floor, I think in a swoon, and I could not have done better. How long I lay I cannot tell, but for a goodish bit, I think. At last I came to myself, rubbed my eyes, and glowered about me, and wondered where I was. At last I bethought myself and scrambled up, and after a great deal of ups and downs I got my carcass dragged out, and now, you may depend upon it, you'll not catch me going in there any more of a sudden. Such, says Mr. Grange, was the result of the search for hidden treasure in the ruined vaults of Dobb Park Lodge. Since that time no one appears to have ventured into those subterranean recesses, so that the chest full of gold still remains, waiting for some explorer to brave the terrors of the talking dog and his surroundings.
Section 111. Dosmery Pool. Who, knowing anything of Cornwall, but is acquainted with Tregeagle, the demon of Dosmery Pool, on Bodmin Downs? How long he has haunted old Cornwall is difficult to say, but his terrible howling, when the wintry blast rushes over the downs, is proverbial, and to roar like Tregeagle is a time-honoured saying. Mr. R. Hunt, in his interesting Popular Romances of the West of England, recounts many exploits of this famous spirit, whose voice is still heard, and whose shadowy form is even still seen, when the winds are at their highest and the nights are the most stormy. Who has not heard of the wild spirit of Tregeagle? Asks Mr. Hunt. He haunts equally the moor, the rocky coasts, and the blown sandhills of Cornwall. From north to south, from east to west, this doomed spirit is heard of, and to the day of judgment he is doomed to wander, pursued by avenging fiends, for ever endeavouring to perform some task by which he hopes to secure repose, and being for ever defeated. Who has not heard of the howling of Tregeagle? When the storms come with all their strength from the Atlantic, and urge themselves upon the rocks around Land's End, the howls of the spirit are louder than the roaring of the winds. When calm rests upon the ocean, and the waves can scarcely form upon the resting waters, low wailings creep along the coast. These are the wailings of this wandering soul. When midnight is on the moor or on the mountains, and the night winds whistle amidst the rugged cairns, the shrieks of Tregeagle are distinctly heard. We know that he is pursued by the demon dogs, and that till daybreak he must fly with all the speed before them. This Tregeagle, whose attributes are so mysterious, and according to the district where related, so varied, is traditionally reported to be the spirit of a tyrannical magistrate, a rapacious and unscrupulous landlord, who was one of the Tregeagles who once owned Trevorder near Bodmin. At the demise of this hardened sinner, who had committed more crimes than the Decalogue contained, the foul fiend wished to at once obtain possession of what he deemed rightly his, to wit the criminal's soul. But the wretched man, in the agony of despair, consigned his wealth to the priesthood, that they might fight with the evil spirit and save his soul from its just doom. The power of the priesthood so far prevailed, that as long as Tregeagle's spirit has some task difficult beyond the power of human nature to perform, demoniac agency should be unable to carry him away. His tasks were to extend into eternity, so that repentance might have time to gradually work out his sin. His only chance of ultimate salvation was in perpetual toil. As long as he continued his labour, the demons could do him no real harm. Frequent were the tussles he had with the fiends. On one occasion his restless spirit is said to have even given evidence in a court of law, when his relentless pursuers vainly endeavoured to carry him off. Tregeagle's first and most famous task was the emptying of Dosmery Pool, a mountain tarn some miles in circumference, and local lore would have he is still engaged upon this endless operation. The difficulty of this gigantic labour was increased by the supposed fact that the lonely pool was bottomless, and yet one learned ecclesiastic was not convinced of the hopelessness of the work, and to decrease the prospect of it ever coming to an end, he proposed that the wretched sinner should only be provided with a limpet shell, with a large hole in it, for the purpose of bailing out the water. The evil one did not lose sight of the doomed Tregeagle, but kept a careful eye on him, and tried every possible means to divert his attention from his task, in order that he might make him his prey. Still the hapless spirit continued to toil, although on one occasion the fiends almost overcame him. Mr. Hunt's graphic account of the terrific struggle is as follows: "Lightnings flashed and coiled like fiery snakes around the rocks of Rofton. Fireballs fell on the desert moors and hissed in the accursed lake. Thunders pealed through the heavens and echoed from hill to hill. An earthquake shook the solid earth, and terror was on all living. The winds rose and raged with a fury which was irresistible, and hail beat so mercilessly on all things that it spread death around. Long did Tread Eagle stand the pelting of the pitiless storm, but at length he yielded to its force and fled. The demons in crowds were at his heels. He doubled, however, on his pursuers and returned to the lake, but so rapid were they that he could not rest the required moment to dip his shell in the now seething waters. 3 times he fled round the lake, and the evil ones pursued him. Then, feeling that there was no safety for him near Dosmery Pool, he sprang swifter than the wind across it, shrieking with agony, and thus, since the devils cannot cross water and were obliged to go round the lake, he gained on them and fled over the moor. Away, away went Tregeagle, faster and faster, the dark spirits pursuing, and they had nearly overtaken him, when he saw Roach Rock and its chapel before him. He rushed up the rocks, with giant power clambered to the eastern window, and dashed his head through it, thus securing the shelter of its sanctity. The defeated demons retired, and long and loud were their wild wailings in the air. The inhabitants of the moors and of the neighbouring towns slept not a wink that night. But the bailing out Dosmery Pool was by no means the only task assigned to Tregeagle's unresting spirit. One labour on the shore near Padstow was to make trusses of sand and ropes of sand with which to bind up the trusses. Each recurring tide swept away the result of his toil, and according to the tradition, the ravings of the baffled soul were louder than the roarings of the winter tempest. By priestly influence Tregeagle was removed to the estuary of the Loo, and ordered to carry sand across to Porthleven. A malicious demon contrived to trip him up, and the contents of his enormous sack supplied the material of the sandbank out of which was formed the bar that destroyed the harbour. Land's End was eventually assigned to Tregeagle as a place of labour, a place where, as Mr. Hunt says, he would find no harbour to destroy and few people to terrify. His task was to sweep the sands from Porthcarnow Cove round the headland called Tall Pen Pentwith into Nangisal Cove. Those who knew that rugged headland, with its cubical masses of granite piled in titanic grandeur one upon another, will appreciate the task. And when to all the difficulties are added the strong sweep of the Atlantic current, that portion of the Gulf Stream which washes our southern shores, it will be evident that the melancholy spirit has, indeed, a task which must endure to the world's end. Even until to-day is Tregeagle labouring at his task. In calms his wailing is heard, and those sounds which some call the soughing of the wind are known to be the moanings of Tregeagle, while the coming storms are predicted by the fearful roarings of this condemned mortal. But these excerpts from Mr. Hunt's account by no means exhaust the deeds or doings of this supernatural being, a thorough belief in whose continual existence is prevalent throughout the length and breadth of old Cornwall. Alluding to the widely diffused belief of a spectre huntsman, whose wild chase permeates the legends of so many lands, Mr. Hunt remarks: "The tradition of the midnight hunter and his headless hounds, always in Cornwall associated with Tregeagle, prevails everywhere. The Abbot's Way on Dartmoor, an ancient road which extends into Cornwall, is said to be the favourite coursing ground of the wish hounds of Dartmoor, called also the Yell hounds. These Yell or Yeff hounds form the theme of the beautiful fragmentary legend of Dartmoor, by the late Oliver Maddox Brown, a legend which the highly talented youth left, unfortunately, unfinished." Section 112,
Edinburgh, Mary King's Close. Old Edinburgh was full of quaint, narrow, antiquated passages, some of which still exist, and these closes, as they are locally called, contained numerous houses bearing the reputation of being haunted. Mary King's Close was noted for the many terrible apparitions which had found suitable quarters within its mouldering dwellings. Mary King's Close has disappeared to make way for modern erections, but just 2 centuries ago That is to say, in 1685, it was a well-to-do thoroughfare, the residence of a respectable class of people. George Sinclair, Professor of Moral Philosophy in the University of Glasgow, and afterwards Minister of Eastwood in Renfrewshire, a contemporary of the events he refers to, gives the following account in Satan's Invisible World Discovered of some terrible apparitions in Mary King's Close, in the house of Mr. Thomas Coltheart, a respectable law agent. Mr. Coltheart's business having improved, he removed into a superior residence in the close above named. Having been warned by some kind neighbour that the house was haunted, the maidservant decamped in haste and left Mr. Coltheart and his wife to manage as they best could. On Sunday afternoon, Mr. Coltheart, being unwell, retired to rest, whilst his wife seated herself at his bedside and read the Scriptures. Happening to raise her eyes, she was intensely horrified to behold the head of an old man with grey floating beard suspended in the air but a short distance off, gazing at her intently with weird fixed glare. She swooned at the sight and remained in an insensible condition until the neighbours came back from church. Her husband did his best to reason her out of her credulity, and the evening passed without anything further taking place. They had not been in bed long, however, before Mr. Coltheart also beheld the phantom head floating in mid-air and surveying him with ghostly eyes. He got up and lit a candle, and then betook himself to prayer. An hour passed, when the spectre head was joined by that of a child, also suspended in the air, followed speedily by an arm, naked from the elbow, which, despite the lawyer's pious ejaculations, seemed to wish to shake hands with him and his wife. In vain did Mr. Coltheart conjure the phantoms to entrust him with the story of their grievances, so that he might have their wrongs rectified. All was useless. They seemed to regard him and his wife as intruders, and to wish them away. Other phantoms joined them, including that of a dog, which curled itself up on a chair and seemed to go to sleep. Others, some of a most horrifying and monstrous form, appeared, until the whole room swarmed with them, and the unfortunate couple were compelled to take refuge on the bed. Suddenly, with a deep and awful groan, all the apparitions vanished, and the pious lawyer and his wife were left in peace. After such a terrifying housewarming, one would suppose that Mr. and Mrs. Coltheart would have got out of the house as quickly as possible, but such was not the case. The brave couple, if Professor Sinclair is to be relied on, continued to reside in the place for many years, until the day of Mr. Coltheart's death, without any further molestation from the spirits. About the time of Mr. Coltheart's death, a strange circumstance happened. A client of his, who lived at Tranent, 10 miles from Edinburgh, was aroused in the night by a nurse who had been affrighted by something like a cloud moving about the room. Starting up, the gentleman instinctively seized his sword, when he was confronted by the face and form of his legal adviser and friend, Thomas Coltheart. "Are you dead?" he demanded. "What is your errand?" Whereupon the apparition shook its head twice and melted away. The gentleman started at once for Edinburgh and proceeded directly to his friend's house in Mary King's Close, and on arriving there, found Mrs. Coltheart bewailing her husband's recent death.